Marcus Chun had always been invisible. At 32, he possessed the remarkable ability to blend into any crowd, any situation, any room without drawing so much as a glance. Standing 5 feet 8 inches with an unremarkable build, wearing clothes that seemed to come from the clearance rack of generic department stores, Marcus was the human equivalent of beige wallpaper. His black hair was neither stylishly messy nor perfectly groomed, just ordinary. His face carried no distinguishing scars, no memorable features, nothing that would make someone think twice about him walking past. This invisibility had served him well throughout his life, though not always by choice. In high school, teachers forgot his name despite having him in class for entire semesters. Colleagues at his accounting firm regularly introduced themselves to him multiple times, genuinely surprised to learn he had been working there for 8 years. Even his own neighbors in the modest apartment complex where he lived seemed startled when they encountered him in the hallway, as if he had materialized from thin air. Marcus worked as a forensic accountant for a mid-sized firm in downtown Seattle. His job involved diving deep into financial records, hunting for discrepancies, fraud, and hidden assets. It was perfect work for someone who preferred numbers to people, patterns to personalities. The irony was not lost on him that while he remained invisible to the world, he possessed an almost supernatural ability to make the invisible visible when it came to financial crimes. Hidden accounts, laundered money, embezzled funds. Marcus could trace them all with the persistence of a bloodhound and the precision of a surgeon. His apartment reflected his personality perfectly. Clean, organized, minimal. A small bookshelf held technical manuals, a few mystery novels, and a single photo of his parents, both deceased from a car accident 5 years earlier. His kitchen contained exactly what he needed and nothing more. His bedroom held a bed, a dresser, and a small desk where he sometimes brought work home. No decorations adorned the walls. No personal touches suggested anyone actually lived there. The morning of March 15 started like every other morning for the past 8 years. Marcus woke at 6:15, showered, ate a simple breakfast of oatmeal and coffee, and arrived at work by 7:30. The office building was a glass and steel monument to corporate efficiency, and Marcus occupied a small cube on the 14th floor, tucked away in a corner where foot traffic was minimal. He powered up his computer and reviewed his current caseload. 3 active investigations, all involving missing funds from various client companies. The most interesting case involved Meridian Holdings, a real estate development company where approximately $2 million had vanished from project accounts over the past 18 months. The disappearance was subtle, sophisticated, and almost impossible to detect without someone specifically looking for it. Marcus thrived on this type of challenge. While others saw endless spreadsheets and incomprehensible financial data, he saw stories. Every transaction told him something about the people behind it, their methods, their weaknesses, their patterns. It was like reading a novel written in numbers instead of words. Around 10 in the morning, his supervisor, Janet Williams, stopped by his cube. She was an efficient woman in her 50s who had the remarkable ability to remember Marcus existed, which made her one of the few people he genuinely respected. "Marcus, we have a new case coming in this afternoon," she said, setting a thin folder on his desk. "Government contract, Department of Defense. They need someone to audit financial records for a company that held several military contracts over the past 5 years." Marcus nodded, opening the folder. The company was called Blackwater Solutions, though he noticed immediately that it had changed names 3 times in the past decade. Red flag number 1. Companies that frequently changed names were usually trying to distance themselves from something. "What type of contracts?" Marcus asked, scanning the preliminary information. "Security services, logistics support, personnel training. Standard military contractor stuff." The Pentagon received an anonymous tip suggesting financial irregularities. They want a complete audit of all government payments to the company. Timeline: they want a preliminary report in 2 weeks, full audit in 6 weeks. "I know it's aggressive, but they're paying premium rates." Marcus examined the documents more carefully. Blackwater Solutions had received over $50 million in government contracts during the specified time period. The anonymous tip had suggested that significant portions of these payments had been diverted to unauthorized accounts. If true, it represented one of the largest cases of defense contractor fraud he had ever seen. "I'll need access to all their financial records, bank statements, payroll information, vendor payments, everything," Marcus said. "Already arranged. They're required to provide full cooperation as part of their contract agreements. You'll have everything by tomorrow morning." After Janet left, Marcus spent the remainder of the morning finishing up documentation on his other cases. But his mind kept drifting to Blackwater Solutions. Something about the case felt different, more significant than the usual corporate fraud investigations he handled. Perhaps it was the military connection or the sheer scale of the potential fraud, but he found himself during his lunch break. Marcus did something he rarely did. He researched the company online. Most of his preliminary research usually waited until he had the official documents, but curiosity got the better of him. What he found was interesting. Blackwater Solutions had been founded 8 years ago by a former military officer named Robert Sterling. Sterling had served 20 years in the Army, retiring as a colonel. The company specialized in providing security services and logistic support for military operations in overseas locations. They had offices in Virginia, Texas, and overseas locations in Germany and Kuwait. On the surface, everything appeared legitimate. The company had good reviews from previous clients, maintained all required certifications, and employed several hundred people. But Marcus had learned to look beyond surfaces. He noticed that many of the company's key personnel seemed to have military backgrounds, which was not unusual for defense contractors. However, when he tried to find detailed information about some of these individuals, he found surprisingly little. More interesting was the pattern of the company's growth. Blackwater had started small, winning minor contracts for logistics support. Then, suddenly, 3 years ago, they had begun winning much larger contracts, including several sole source awards that bypassed normal competitive bidding processes. The jump in contract values was dramatic and would definitely warrant closer examination. Marcus made notes of his observations and returned to work. The afternoon passed quickly as he wrapped up loose ends on his other cases, preparing to dedicate most of his time to the Blackwater investigation. At precisely 5:30, Marcus shut down his computer and prepared to leave. As he walked toward the elevator, he noticed a man in an expensive suit talking quietly with Janet near her office. The man was tall, probably 6'2", with the kind of build that suggested regular physical training. His posture was perfectly straight, and something about the way he held himself reminded Marcus of military personnel he had occasionally encountered at his work. The man's eyes swept the office area and briefly made contact with Marcus. For just a moment, Marcus felt an unusual sensation, the feeling of being truly seen. Most people looked through him or past him, but this man's gaze seemed to register and file away details about Marcus in a way that felt almost invasive. Marcus continued to the elevator without breaking stride, but he found himself glancing back. The man was still talking with Janet, but Marcus caught him looking in his direction again. This time, the man's expression seemed curious, as if Marcus had somehow attracted his attention. The elevator arrived, and Marcus stepped inside. As the doors began to close, he saw the man shake hands with Janet and head toward the elevator bank. Marcus pressed the button to close the doors more quickly, though he could not have explained why. During the drive home, Marcus could not shake the feeling that the encounter had been significant somehow. In 8 years of working at the firm, no one had ever looked at him the way that man had, with focused attention and apparent recognition, as if Marcus was someone worth noticing. He tried to dismiss the feeling as paranoia, but it lingered throughout the evening. As he prepared dinner and settled in to read, Marcus found his thoughts returning to both Blackwater Solutions and the mysterious man who had been talking with Janet. Something told him that his quiet, predictable life was about to become much more complicated. That night, Marcus dreamed about numbers that moved and shifted like living things, rearranging themselves into patterns that almost made sense before dissolving into chaos. In the dream, someone was watching him work, studying his methods, learning his techniques. He woke several times during the night with the distinct feeling that his invisibility, his greatest asset and protection, had somehow been compromised. The next morning brought the promised delivery from Blackwater Solutions. 12 boxes of financial records, digital drives containing electronic files, and a stack of documents that would keep Marcus busy for weeks. As he began the initial organization of the materials, Marcus noticed something that made him pause. The documents were too well organized. In 8 years of conducting audits, Marcus had never received materials that were so perfectly structured, so carefully prepared. Most companies responded to audit requests by dumping whatever records they could find in the boxes and hoping for the best. This level of organization suggested either exceptional record-keeping practices or careful preparation designed to present a specific picture. Marcus made a note to himself. These people knew they were being audited and had time to prepare. The question was whether they had used that time to organize legitimate records or to hide evidence of fraud. As he began his initial review of the financial data, Marcus discovered that his instincts had been correct. The numbers told a story, and it was not the story that Blackwater Solutions wanted to tell. Hidden within the seemingly legitimate transactions were patterns that suggested systematic diversion of funds. The fraud was sophisticated, involving multiple layers of shell companies and carefully disguised transfers. But it was there. What made Marcus pause was the realization that this level of sophistication suggested someone with extensive knowledge of both financial systems and audit procedures. Someone who knew exactly what investigators would look for and had taken steps to hide the evidence accordingly. For the first time in his career, Marcus began to wonder if he was hunting someone who might be hunting him back. 3 days into the Blackwater audit, Marcus had uncovered enough evidence to know he was dealing with something far more complex than typical contractor fraud. The financial manipulation was masterful, involving a web of subsidiary companies, overseas accounts, and timing schemes that would have been invisible to most auditors. But Marcus was not most auditors. He had identified at least $8 million in diverted funds, though he suspected the actual amount was significantly higher. The money had been systematically skimmed from legitimate contract payments through a series of what appeared to be vendor payments for services that had never been provided. Each individual transaction was small enough to avoid triggering automated oversight systems, but collectively they represented a substantial theft from the American taxpayers. What disturbed Marcus more than the fraud itself was the sophistication of the operation. Someone inside Blackwater understood government contracting procedures, financial oversight mechanisms, and audit techniques with the precision of a professional. This was not opportunistic theft by someone skimming cash from petty accounts. This was organized, systematic, and executed by someone who knew exactly how investigations worked. Marcus had been so focused on the financial patterns that he almost missed the more subtle story hidden in the personnel records. Blackwater employed 43 people in various capacities, from administrative support to field operatives. Most had standard employment histories and backgrounds, but 7 employees had files that seemed oddly incomplete. These 7 individuals all shared certain characteristics: military backgrounds with service records that contained significant gaps, employment start dates that did not align with the company's official hiring records, and personal information that was strangely minimal. No emergency contacts beyond immediate family, no previous addresses before joining Blackwater, and salary payments that did not match their official job descriptions. Marcus cross-referenced these names with the financial transactions he had flagged as suspicious. 4 of the 7 names appeared as authorized signatories on accounts that had been used to transfer money to shell companies. It was the first direct connection between specific individuals and the fraud. He was documenting this discovery when his phone rang. The caller ID showed his supervisor's extension. "Marcus, can you come to my office, please?" Janet's voice carried a tension he had not heard before. Marcus saved his work, secured his files, and walked to Janet's corner office. Through the glass walls, He could see Janet sitting across from the same man he had noticed 3 days earlier. The man turned as Marcus approached, and once again, Marcus felt that uncomfortable sensation of being truly observed. "Marcus, this is David Harrison from the Department of Defense," Janet said as he entered. "He's the liaison for the Blackwater audit." Harrison stood and extended his hand. His grip was firm without being aggressive, and his eyes held the same focused attention Marcus had noticed before. Harrison was probably in his early 40s, with graying hair that was cut with military precision. Everything about him suggested discipline, control, and careful observation. "Mr. Chun, I understand you've made significant progress on the audit," Harrison said. His voice was calm, professional, but Marcus detected something underneath, perhaps concern, perhaps caution. "I've identified several areas that warrant investigation," Marcus replied carefully. He had learned over the years to be cautious about sharing preliminary findings, especially with people he did not know. "I'm sure you understand the sensitive nature of this case," Harrison continued. "We appreciate your thoroughness, but we also want to ensure that any conclusions are based on solid evidence." Marcus nodded, though something in Harrison's tone suggested this was more than a standard request for accuracy. "Of course, I always ensure my findings are properly documented and verifiable." "Excellent. I wonder if we might discuss your progress in more detail. Perhaps we could meet tomorrow to review what you've found so far." Janet looked between the two men, clearly sensing some undercurrent she did not understand. "That will be fine," she said. "Marcus, can you prepare a preliminary summary for Mr. Harrison?" "Certainly," Marcus replied, though he found himself reluctant to share his findings with Harrison. Something about the man's demeanor suggested more than professional interest in the audit results. After Harrison left, Janet remained at her office reviewing other files, but Marcus noticed her glancing in his direction more frequently than usual. The entire interaction had left him feeling exposed and uncertain. That evening, Marcus worked late at the office, using the quiet time to dig deeper into the Blackwater files. He wanted to have a complete picture before meeting with Harrison the next day. As he worked, several patterns became clearer. The 7 employees with incomplete files were not just connected to the financial fraud. They appear to be the primary operators of the scheme. Cross-referencing their access permissions with the timing of suspicious transactions showed a clear correlation. These individuals had been systematically looting government contracts for at least 3 years. More disturbing was what Marcus discovered when he tried to verify their backgrounds. The military service records that Blackwater had provided for these employees contained discrepancies when compared to publicly available information. Service dates did not match. Unit assignments seemed fabricated, and, in 2 cases, the individuals appeared to have been listed as killed in action in military databases. Marcus stared at his computer screen, trying to process what he was seeing. 2 of the people currently employed by Blackwater Solutions were officially listed as deceased in military personnel records. Their deaths had been recorded 3 and 4 years ago, respectively, in overseas operations. Either the military records were wrong, or Marcus had stumbled onto something far more serious than financial fraud. People who were officially dead but still walking around usually meant one of 2 things: witness protection or intelligence operations gone wrong. Marcus printed copies of everything he had found and secured them in a locked file cabinet. His usual practice was to keep all audit materials in electronic format, but something told him that physical copies might be important in this case. The next morning, Harrison arrived at the office precisely at 9 o'clock. Marcus had prepared a summary of his financial findings, but had deliberately omitted the information about the deceased employees. Some instinct warned him to keep that discovery to himself until he better understood what was happening. "Your work is quite impressive," Harrison said after reviewing Marcus's preliminary report. "You've identified financial irregularities that our initial review missed entirely." "Thank you. However, I should mention that this is just the beginning. The patterns I've identified suggest the fraud is more extensive than these initial findings indicate." Harrison leaned back in his chair, studying Marcus carefully. "How much more extensive?" "Potentially $20 to $30 million, possibly more." The operation has been running for several years and involves multiple layers of financial manipulation. For the first time, Harrison's professional composure seemed to slip slightly. Marcus caught a flash of what might have been concern or perhaps alarm in his expression. "That's a significant allegation," Harrison said finally. "You're certain of these numbers?" "The evidence is solid. I can provide detailed documentation for every transaction I've flagged." Harrison was quiet for several minutes, apparently considering his response. When he spoke again, his tone had changed subtly. "Mr. Chun, I need to ask you to be extremely careful about who you discuss these findings with. This investigation has implications beyond simple contractor fraud." "What kind of implications?" "The kind that could be dangerous for people who know too much about them." The statement hung in the air between them like a warning. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine as he realized that his quiet, invisible life had suddenly become much more complicated and potentially dangerous. "I understand," Marcus replied, though he was not certain he understood anything at all. "I hope you do," Harrison said, standing up. "I'll be in touch soon to discuss how we proceed with the investigation." After Harrison left, Marcus sat alone in the conference room, trying to process what had just happened. The conversation had felt less like a briefing and more like a warning. Harrison's final comment about things being dangerous for people who knew too much was particularly unsettling. Marcus returned to his desk and continued working on the audit, but he found it difficult to concentrate. Every sound in the office seemed louder. Every person who walked past his cube seemed to be watching him. The paranoia was probably unfounded, but Marcus had survived 32 years by trusting his instincts, and his instincts were telling him that he had stumbled into something much bigger than a simple fraud case. That afternoon, Marcus made a decision that would have been unthinkable just a week earlier. Instead of going straight home after work, he drove to a different part of the city and purchased a small fireproof safe from a hardware store. He paid cash and gave a false name when the clerk asked for information for the warranty registration. That evening, he made copies of all his Blackwater files and stored them in the safe, which he hid in his apartment. If something happened to the official audit files, he wanted to ensure that evidence of the fraud would survive. As he worked, Marcus reflected on how dramatically his life had changed in just a few days. 3 weeks ago, his biggest concern had been whether to buy name brand or generic breakfast cereal. Now he was hiding evidence of what appeared to be a massive fraud scheme involving people who were officially dead and a government liaison who spoke in veiled threats. The most unsettling part was the growing realization that his lifelong invisibility might not protect him this time. Someone had noticed him, someone was watching him, and someone wanted to control what he discovered and how he reported it. Marcus had always prided himself on being a thorough, honest professional. But as he looked at the evidence spread across his kitchen table, he began to understand that honesty and thoroughness might not be enough this time. He was going to need to be smart, careful, and very lucky if he wanted to survive whatever he had gotten himself into. The next few days would determine whether Marcus Chun would remain an invisible accountant or become a very visible target. Marcus spent the weekend analyzing the Blackwater files from every possible angle, working methodically through bank records, personnel files, and contract documents. What he discovered made him question everything he thought he knew about the case. The 2 employees who were officially listed as deceased were not anomalies. When Marcus expanded his search and cross-referenced all 43 Blackwater employees with various government databases, he found that 11 of them had significant discrepancies in their official records. Some had Social Security numbers that had been issued after their supposed birth dates. Others had driver's license records that began only a few years ago with no prior history. 3 had military service records that contained impossible overlaps in deployment locations. These were not clerical errors. Someone had systematically created false identities for a significant portion of Blackwater's workforce. The company was not just involved in financial fraud. It was operating as a front for people who needed to disappear from their previous lives. When he arrived at work, he found a message from Janet asking him to come to her office immediately. When he arrived, he found her sitting with two men in dark suits who introduced themselves as agents from the FBI. "Mr. Chun, we understand you're conducting an audit of Blackwater Solutions," said Agent Miller, a thin man with intense eyes. "We need to discuss your findings." Marcus glanced at Janet, who looked worried and confused. "I wasn't aware the FBI was involved in this case. We became involved when the Defense Department shared some concerns about the scope of the investigation," said Agent Rodriguez, Miller's partner. "We need to coordinate our efforts to ensure nothing interferes with an ongoing federal investigation." The statement was clearly designed to intimidate Marcus into compliance, but it had the opposite effect. If the FBI was suddenly interested in his audit, it meant he had discovered something significant enough to warrant their attention. "What kind of ongoing investigation?" Marcus asked. "That's classified," Miller replied. "What we can tell you is that your audit needs to be suspended immediately. All materials related to Blackwater Solutions are now part of a federal investigation. I was hired by the Department of Defense to conduct this audit. I can't suspend it without authorization from my client." Rodriguez leaned forward. "Mr. Chun, you need to understand that you've stumbled into something much bigger than a simple fraud case. For your own safety and for the integrity of our investigation, you need to step away from this audit immediately." Marcus felt the same chill he had experienced during his conversation with Harrison. Another veiled threat, another warning about safety. Someone desperately wanted him to stop digging into Blackwater's finances. "I'll need to speak with my supervisor and my client before I can agree to suspend the audit," Marcus said carefully. Miller and Rodriguez exchanged glances. "We'll give you 24 hours to make the appropriate arrangements," Miller said. "After that, we'll be forced to take more direct action to protect our investigation." After the agents left, Janet looked at Marcus with concern. "What kind of case have we gotten ourselves into?" "I'm not sure," Marcus replied, though he was beginning to have a very clear picture of what was happening. "But I think we need to be very careful about how we proceed." Marcus spent the rest of the day thinking about his options. He could comply with the FBI's request, turn over all his materials, and go back to his quiet, invisible life. It was the safe choice, the smart choice, and probably what any reasonable person would do. But Marcus had never been accused of being reasonable. He had spent his entire career following financial trails wherever they led, regardless of who wanted them buried. The idea of walking away from the biggest fraud case he had ever encountered was professionally and personally unacceptable. That evening, Marcus made several decisions that would fundamentally change his life. First, he created additional copies of all his Blackwater files and stored them in multiple locations. Second, he began researching the FBI agents who had visited his office. Third, he started documenting everything that had happened since the audit began, creating a detailed timeline of events and conversations. His research into Agent Miller and Rodriguez yielded interesting results. Both men were legitimate FBI agents, but neither specialized in financial crimes or government contractor fraud. Miller's background was in organized crime investigations, while Rodriguez had spent most of his career working counterterrorism cases. It was an unusual pairing for an audit-related investigation. More suspicious was the timing of their involvement. The FBI had apparently been contacted about the Blackwater audit only 2 days after Marcus's meeting with Harrison. Someone had moved very quickly to bring federal law enforcement into the case, and Marcus doubted it was because they wanted a thorough investigation of the financial irregularities. Tuesday morning brought no official word from the Defense Department about suspending the audit, so Marcus continued his work. He focused on tracing the overseas accounts that had received the diverted funds, using contacts he had developed over the years in international banking compliance. What he discovered was disturbing. The shell companies receiving money from Blackwater were connected to accounts in countries known for harboring individuals fleeing American justice. The money was being used to support people who had reasons to stay hidden from U.S. authorities. Marcus was beginning to understand the true scope of what Blackwater represented. It was not just a defense contractor committing fraud. It was a sophisticated operation designed to help certain individuals disappear from their previous lives while generating income through government contracts. The fraud was not the primary purpose, it was the funding mechanism for something much larger. That afternoon, Marcus received an unexpected phone call. The caller identified himself as Thomas Mitchell and said he needed to meet with Marcus about the Blackwater audit. Mitchell's voice was calm, but urgent, and something in his tone suggested this was not another attempt to shut down the investigation. "I can't discuss the audit over the phone," Marcus replied. "If you have concerns about the investigation, you'll need to contact my supervisor or the Defense Department liaison." "Mr. Chun, I'm calling because I believe you're in danger," Mitchell said. "The people you're investigating are not typical white-collar criminals. They have resources and skills that make them extremely dangerous when they feel threatened." Marcus felt his pulse quicken. "Who are you? How do you know about the investigation?" "I can't explain over the phone. Can you meet me tonight?" 7 o'clock at Pike Place Market, near the fish vendors. Marcus hesitated. Meeting a stranger who had called him out of the blue seemed like an excellent way to walk into a trap. But Mitchell's warning about danger echoed concerns that had been growing in Marcus's mind for days. "How do I know you're not one of the people trying to shut down the investigation?" "Because if I were, you'd already be dead," Mitchell replied matter-of-factly. "These people don't send warnings or make threats they don't intend to carry out. The fact that you're still breathing means they're trying to handle you quietly, but that won't last much longer." The conversation ended with Marcus agreeing to the meeting, though he spent the rest of the afternoon questioning the wisdom of that decision. Everything about the situation felt dangerous, but Marcus was beginning to realize that danger might be unavoidable regardless of what choices he made. That evening, Marcus arrived at Pike Place Market 30 minutes early and positioned himself where he could observe the meeting location. The market was busy with tourists and locals, providing good cover for surveillance, but also making it difficult to identify potential threats. At precisely 7 o'clock, a man approached the designated meeting spot. He was average height and build, probably in his late 30s, with the kind of unremarkable appearance that would make him difficult to remember or describe. In other words, he looked a lot like Marcus. "Mr. Chun," the man asked, extending his hand. "Thomas Mitchell. Thank you for coming." Marcus shook his hand, noting that Mitchell's grip and posture suggested military or law enforcement background. "You said I was in danger. What kind of danger?" "The kind that involves people with advanced training in making problems disappear," Mitchell replied. "Walk with me." As they moved through the market, Mitchell explained his background. He was a former Navy SEAL who had worked for Blackwater Solutions 2 years earlier. He had discovered the financial fraud and attempted to report it through proper channels. Instead of an investigation, he had found himself framed for theft and forced to leave the company under threat of prosecution. The operation is run by Robert Sterling and a small group of former military personnel who have been classified as killed in action, Mitchell explained. They use Blackwater as a front to launder money and provide new identities for people who need to disappear from their previous lives. People like who? War criminals, corrupt officials, intelligence operatives whose covers have been blown, anyone with the money to pay for a complete identity change. The government contracts provide legitimacy and funding for the operation. Marcus absorbed this information, trying to fit it with what he had discovered in his audit. "How much money are we talking about?" "Over the past 3 years, probably $50 million. But money isn't the real issue here. The people they're helping to disappear include some very dangerous individuals. If this operation is exposed, it will create problems for a lot of powerful people. Then, why are you telling me this? Why not go to the authorities yourself?" Mitchell stopped walking and looked at Marcus directly. "Because I tried that. I contacted the FBI, the Pentagon Inspector General's office, even congressional oversight committees. What I discovered is that Sterling has protection from people high enough in the government to make official complaints disappear. So what am I supposed to do with this information? Be very careful. Document everything. And understand that the people trying to shut down your investigation are not going to give up easily. They have too much to lose." As they prepared to part ways, Mitchell handed Marcus a small piece of paper with a phone number written on it. "If something happens to you, if you disappear or have an accident, call this number. Tell them what you discovered about Blackwater. It's the only way this story will ever see the light of day. Marcus walked back to his car with his mind racing. Everything Mitchell had told him confirmed his worst suspicions about the Blackwater investigation. He was not just auditing a fraudulent defense contractor. He was threatening an operation that provided protection and new identities for dangerous people with powerful connections. The question now was what to do with this knowledge. Marcus could walk away, destroy his files, and hope that his previous invisibility would protect him. Or he could continue the investigation, knowing that doing so would make him a target for people who had already demonstrated their willingness to kill to protect their secrets. As he drove home, Marcus realized that his quiet, predictable life was over. Whether he continued the investigation or abandoned it, he was now involved in something that would change everything. The only question was whether he would choose to be a victim or a threat to the people who wanted him silenced. Marcus spent a sleepless night weighing his options. By morning, he had reached a decision that surprised him. For 32 years, he had lived as an invisible man, avoiding conflict, staying in the background, never drawing attention to himself. But the Blackwater investigation had changed something fundamental inside him. He could not walk away from the biggest case of his career, regardless of the personal cost. Wednesday morning brought confirmation that his decision was the right one. When Marcus arrived at work, he found his desk had been searched. The search had been professional, careful, and almost undetectable, but Marcus had developed precise habits over the years about how he arranged his workspace. Someone had gone through his files, his computer, and even his desk drawers. More alarming was the discovery that someone had attempted to access his computer overnight. The login logs showed several failed attempts to crack his password, followed by what appeared to be a successful breach using administrative credentials. Whoever was behind this had serious technical resources and official authorization to override normal security protocols. Marcus immediately contacted Janet and reported the security breach. She seemed genuinely shocked and promised to investigate, but Marcus noticed that she seemed nervous and distracted throughout their conversation. He began to wonder how many people in his own organization could be trusted. That afternoon, Marcus received a visit from David Harrison, the Defense Department liaison. Harrison's demeanor had changed significantly since their last meeting. Gone was the professional courtesy, replaced by barely concealed hostility. "Mr. Chun, I understand you've been asking questions about the Blackwater investigation beyond the scope of your original assignment," Harrison said, closing the conference room door behind him. "I've been conducting a thorough audit as requested. Following financial trails is part of my job. Your job is to identify financial irregularities, not to investigate the backgrounds of company personnel or question the legitimacy of government oversight procedures." Marcus realized that Harrison knew about his research into the deceased employees and his contacts with international banking sources. Someone was monitoring his activities very closely. "Are you ordering me to limit the scope of my investigation?" Marcus asked. "I'm ordering you to remember that you're a civilian contractor with a specific assignment. Exceeding that assignment could be considered a breach of your security obligations and grounds for prosecution under federal law." The threat was explicit this time. Harrison was no longer bothering with subtlety or professional courtesy. Marcus was being told to back off or face serious consequences. "I understand," Marcus replied, though he had no intention of complying. After Harrison left, Marcus made a decision that would have been unthinkable just a week earlier. He began planning to steal the evidence he had discovered. That evening, Marcus stayed late at the office, ostensibly to finish documentation on his other cases. In reality, he spent the time creating encrypted copies of all his Blackwater files and transferring them to external drives. He also documented everything that had happened since the investigation began, including his conversations with Harrison, the FBI agents, and Thomas Mitchell. The most important discovery came when Marcus decided to research Harrison himself. Using the same techniques he had employed to investigate Blackwater employees, Marcus discovered that David Harrison's background contained the same types of discrepancies he had found in the fraudulent personnel files. Harrison's military service record had gaps, His employment history before joining the Defense Department was sparse, and his Social Security number had anomalies that suggested it might be fabricated. Marcus realized that Harrison was not a government liaison investigating fraud. He was part of the operation trying to cover it up. The Defense Department had not hired Marcus to uncover corruption. They had hired him to provide a legitimate cover story for shutting down any investigation into Blackwater's activities. This revelation changed everything. Marcus was not dealing with a simple case of contractor fraud that had attracted unwanted attention. He had been deliberately selected as the investigator because his quiet, compliant personality made him seem like someone who could be easily controlled. The entire audit had been a setup from the beginning. Thursday morning brought the final confirmation of Marcus's suspicions. When he arrived at work, Janet informed him that the Blackwater audit was being transferred to another firm. The official reason was that the scope of the investigation required specialized expertise that Marcus's firm could not provide. "I'm sorry, Marcus," Janet said, and she seemed genuinely apologetic. "I know how much work you've put into this case, but the decision came from very high up in the Defense Department. There's nothing I can do." Marcus nodded and accepted the news calmly, but internally he was furious. They were taking him off the case because he had discovered too much. Someone had realized that quiet, invisible Marcus Chun was not as controllable as they had assumed. "When do I need to transfer the files?" Marcus asked. "This afternoon. Agent Miller is coming to collect all the materials at 3 o'clock. Marcus spent the morning preparing the official files for transfer, but he kept his encrypted copies hidden. When Miller arrived that afternoon, Marcus handed over boxes of documents with the same professionalism he had always displayed. Miller seemed satisfied that he was getting everything, unaware that the most damaging evidence was safely stored in multiple locations. That evening, Marcus made the phone call that would change his life forever. He dialed the number Thomas Mitchell had given him and waited for someone to answer. "This is Marcus Chun," he said when a voice answered. "Tom Mitchell told me to call this number if something happened with the Blackwater investigation." "Hold on," the voice replied. After a few minutes, a different person came on the line. "Mr. Chun, this is Commander Sarah Walsh, Naval Criminal Investigative Service. Tom Mitchell briefed us about your situation. Are you somewhere safe?" Marcus looked around his quiet apartment, realizing that nowhere was truly safe anymore. "For now, but they've shut down my investigation and seized all the official files. Do you still have copies of your findings?" "Yes, everything. We need to meet immediately. How quickly can you get to Naval Station Everett?" Marcus had never been to a naval base, but he knew it was about 30 miles north of Seattle. "An hour, maybe 90 minutes. Come to the main gate and ask for Commander Walsh. Don't tell anyone where you're going, don't stop anywhere on the way, and watch for surveillance. If you think you're being followed, keep driving and call me back." The drive to Naval Station Everett was the longest hour and a half of Marcus's life. He found himself checking his mirrors constantly, changing lanes randomly, and taking detours to ensure he was not being followed. The paranoia felt ridiculous, but everything that had happened over the past week had taught him that his instincts for danger needed serious recalibration. The naval base was an imposing sight, with serious-looking guards, substantial fencing, and an atmosphere of disciplined efficiency that reminded Marcus how far outside his normal world he had traveled. After verifying his identity and making several phone calls, the guard directed him to a parking area where Commander Walsh was waiting. Sarah Walsh was a woman in her early 40s with the bearing of someone accustomed to command. She was tall, fit, and carried herself with the confidence of someone who had earned respect through competence rather than politics. When she shook Marcus's hand, her grip was firm and her eyes were direct. "Mr. Chun, thank you for coming. We have a lot to discuss." Walsh led Marcus to a secure conference room where two other people were waiting. She introduced them as Agent Jennifer Parr from the FBI and Lieutenant Colonel David Rodriguez from the Army Criminal Investigation Command. Marcus noticed that Agent Rodriguez shared a name with one of the FBI agents who had tried to shut down his investigation, but this was clearly a different person. We've been investigating Robert Sterling and Blackwater Solutions for 2 years, Walsh explained. But every time we get close to building a case, our investigation gets shut down by people with higher authority than us. What you've discovered may be the key to finally exposing this operation. Marcus spent the next 3 hours walking them through his findings. He showed them the financial evidence of fraud, the personnel files with fabricated backgrounds, the connections to overseas money laundering operations, and his discoveries about David Harrison's fraudulent identity. "This is exactly what we needed," Agent Park said after reviewing the evidence. "Financial crimes are much easier to prosecute than the other activities we suspect Sterling is involved in. We can use this to take down the entire operation. But you need to understand the danger you're in," Walsh added. "Sterling and his people are former special operations personnel with advanced training in violence and intimidation. They have connections throughout the military and intelligence communities. They won't hesitate to eliminate threats to their operation." "What am I supposed to do?" Marcus asked. "Go into hiding? Leave the country? We're going to put you in protective custody while we build the case," Walsh replied. "It will take several months to gather enough evidence for prosecution, and we need to keep you safe during that time." Marcus thought about his quiet apartment, his predictable job, his invisible life. All of it would disappear if he agreed to protective custody. But the alternative was probably worse. What happens after the case is resolved? If we're successful in prosecuting Sterling and his associates, you'll be able to return to your normal life. If we're not successful, you'll need to consider more permanent relocation options. Marcus realized that his old life was over regardless of what choice he made. The quiet, invisible existence that had protected him for 32 years had been shattered the moment he discovered the truth about Blackwater Solutions. "There's something else you should know," Lieutenant Colonel Rodriguez said. "We believe Sterling has been eliminating people who pose threats to his operation. 3 individuals who tried to expose Blackwater over the past 2 years have died in apparent accidents or suicides. We don't think those deaths were coincidental." The statement hung in the air like a death sentence. Marcus understood that he was not just risking his comfortable life. He was risking his life itself. "If I agree to protective custody, how long will it take to build the case?" 6 to 9 months, possibly longer, Walsh replied. "Sterling has powerful connections, so we need to build an absolutely airtight case before we move against him." Marcus thought about Thomas Mitchell, who had tried to expose the operation and been forced into hiding. He thought about the 3 people who had died for trying to tell the truth. He thought about his parents, who had always taught him to do the right thing regardless of the personal cost. "I'll do it," Marcus said finally. "But I want one thing in return." "What's that?" "When this is over, I want Sterling and everyone involved in this operation to pay for what they've done. No plea bargains, no reduced sentences, no quiet retirements. They destroyed my life and killed innocent people. I want justice." Walsh smiled for the first time since their meeting began. "Mr. Chun, I think that can be arranged." As Marcus prepared to leave his old life behind and enter federal protection, he reflected on how dramatically things had changed. A week ago, he had been invisible, forgotten, overlooked by everyone around him. Now he was the key witness in a federal investigation that could bring down a criminal organization with connections throughout the government and military. The irony was not lost on him. Marcus Chun, the man who had spent his entire life trying to be invisible, was about to become the most important person in a case that would likely make national headlines. His quiet life was over, but perhaps something better was about to begin. 9 months later, Marcus stood in the witness box of a federal courthouse in Washington, D.C., facing the most intimidating collection of defense attorneys he had ever seen. Across the courtroom, Robert Sterling and 6 of his associates sat at the defendant's table, their faces showing no emotion as Marcus prepared to testify about the evidence that would send them to prison for the rest of their lives. The months in protective custody had been difficult but productive. Marcus had worked with federal prosecutors to organize his evidence into an unshakable case against Blackwater Solutions and its criminal enterprise. What had started as a simple audit of contractor fraud had become the largest prosecution of military contract corruption in American history. The investigation had grown far beyond Marcus's original discoveries. Using his financial evidence as a foundation, federal agents had uncovered a network that included corrupt Pentagon officials, foreign intelligence operatives, and war criminals who had purchased new identities through Sterling's operation. The fraud that Marcus had initially estimated at $30 million turned out to involve over $100 million in stolen government funds. More importantly, the investigation had revealed that Sterling's operation had been responsible for at least 8 murders over the past 3 years. People who had threatened to expose the scheme had died in carefully staged accidents and suicides. Thomas Mitchell had been right about the danger. Marcus would almost certainly have been killed if he had tried to continue the investigation on his own. "Mr. Chun," said the lead prosecutor, Assistant U.S. Attorney Rebecca Martinez, "please tell the court how you first became involved in investigating Blackwater Solutions." Marcus had practiced this testimony dozens of times, but facing the actual defendants made him nervous. Sterling was staring at him with cold, calculating eyes, as if measuring him for a coffin. The other defendants showed similar expressions of barely contained hostility. "I was assigned to conduct a routine audit of the company's government contracts," Marcus began, his voice steady despite his nervousness. "What I discovered was a sophisticated scheme to defraud the American taxpayers of millions of dollars." Over the next 4 hours, Marcus walked the jury through his investigation, explaining how he had identified the financial irregularities, traced the money to overseas accounts, and discovered the false identities of key Blackwater employees. He testified about his meetings with David Harrison, who had turned out to be a former CIA operative working for Sterling under a fabricated identity. The defense attorneys tried to attack Marcus's credibility, suggesting that he had fabricated evidence or misunderstood legitimate business transactions. But Marcus's reputation for thoroughness and accuracy served him well. His testimony was detailed, well-documented, and impossible to discredit. The most dramatic moment came when Marcus testified about the 3 people who had died while trying to expose Sterling's operation. The prosecutor displayed photographs of the victims on screens throughout the courtroom, and Marcus explained how each person had discovered evidence of corruption shortly before their deaths. "These were not accidents," Marcus said, looking directly at Sterling. "These people were murdered because they threatened to expose what I'm exposing today." Sterling's composure cracked slightly, and Marcus caught a flash of rage in his eyes. It was the first time during the trial that Sterling had shown any emotion, and Marcus realized that his testimony was having exactly the impact the prosecutors had hoped for. The defense's cross-examination was aggressive, but ineffective. Marcus had spent months preparing for every possible question, and his answers were precise, factual, and damaging to the defendants. By the time he stepped down from the witness stand, Marcus knew that his testimony had been successful. The trial lasted 6 weeks, with dozens of witnesses testifying about different aspects of Sterling's criminal enterprise. Federal agents described surveillance operations, financial experts explained the money laundering schemes, and former Blackwater employees testified about the company's illegal activities. The most compelling witness was Thomas Mitchell, who had emerged from hiding to testify about his own experiences with Sterling's operation. Mitchell described how he had discovered the fraud, tried to report it through official channels, and been threatened with death if he continued his investigation. "Robert Sterling told me directly that people who caused problems for his operation had a tendency to die in accidents," Mitchell testified. He said it would be unfortunate if something happened to me or my family. When the prosecution rested its case, the defense attempted to argue that Blackwater was a legitimate defense contractor that had been targeted by overzealous investigators. They portrayed Sterling as a patriotic veteran who had been falsely accused by disgruntled former employees and ambitious federal prosecutors. The jury was not convinced. After deliberating for 3 days, they returned guilty verdicts on all counts against all defendants. Sterling was convicted of fraud, money laundering, conspiracy, and multiple counts of murder. His associates received similar convictions for their roles in the operation. At sentencing, Sterling received life in prison without the possibility of parole. His associates received sentences ranging from 25 years to life. The judge described the case as one of the most serious examples of military contractor corruption he had ever seen. This conspiracy betrayed the trust of the American people and resulted in the deaths of innocent individuals who tried to expose the truth, Judge William Anderson said during sentencing. The defendants showed no remorse for their actions and would undoubtedly continue their criminal enterprise if given the opportunity. After the trial, Marcus found himself facing an unexpected problem: celebrity. His role in exposing the conspiracy had made him a public figure, and media outlets wanted interviews about his experience. Book publishers offered contracts for his story, and Hollywood producers expressed interest in adapting his experience for film. Marcus declined most of these opportunities, preferring to return to something resembling his previous quiet existence. However, his experience with the Blackwater case had changed him in fundamental ways. He could never again be the invisible, passive person he had been before. The accounting firm where Marcus had worked offered him a promotion and a substantial raise, recognizing that his newfound expertise in government contractor fraud made him extremely valuable. Marcus accepted the promotion, but negotiated to work exclusively on cases involving public corruption and white-collar crime. 6 months after the trial ended, Marcus received an unexpected visitor at his new office. Commander Sarah Walsh, who had been promoted to captain following the successful prosecution of Sterling's operation, came to discuss a new case. "We have another situation that requires someone with your particular skills," Walsh explained. "A defense contractor in Texas that we suspect is involved in similar activities to Blackwater. Are you interested?" Marcus looked out the window of his corner office, thinking about how much his life had changed. He was no longer invisible, no longer forgotten, no longer someone who could be overlooked or intimidated. The quiet accountant who had stumbled onto the Blackwater conspiracy had evolved into someone who actively hunted corruption and fraud. "What's the company's name?" Marcus asked. "Titan Security Services. They've been awarded several large contracts over the past 2 years, and we have reason to believe they're following the same pattern as Sterling's operation." Marcus smiled for the first time in months. "When do I start?" The investigation of Titan Security would become Marcus's next major case, leading to the exposure of another criminal network and the conviction of dozens of corrupt officials. Over the following years, Marcus would become one of the country's leading experts on defense contractor fraud, testifying before Congress and training other investigators in techniques for uncovering sophisticated financial crimes. But he never forgot the lesson he had learned during the Blackwater investigation. Sometimes the most dangerous criminals are the ones who hide behind legitimate businesses and government contracts. Sometimes the people entrusted with protecting national security are the ones who pose the greatest threat to it. Most importantly, Marcus learned that being invisible was not always an advantage. Sometimes the most important thing a person could do was to stand up, be seen, and speak truth to power, regardless of the personal cost. Thomas Mitchell eventually emerged from hiding and returned to his family, protected by the convictions of the people who had threatened him. The families of the 3 people murdered by Sterling's operation received justice and closure, knowing that their loved ones had died as heroes who tried to expose corruption. David Harrison, the fake Defense Department liaison, was sentenced to 25 years in prison for his role in the conspiracy. The FBI agents who had tried to shut down Marcus's investigation were revealed to be legitimate agents who had been misled by false information from Sterling's associates in the Pentagon. The Pentagon implemented new oversight procedures for defense contractor audits, ensuring that future investigations could not be compromised by corrupt officials. Congress passed legislation strengthening protections for whistleblowers and investigators who uncover government contract fraud. 5 years after the Blackwater trial, Marcus received a letter from Robert Sterling in federal prison. Sterling wrote that he respected Marcus's integrity and persistence, admitting that he had underestimated the quiet accountant who had brought down his empire. "You were invisible until you chose not to be," Sterling wrote. That choice destroyed my life, but I have to admire the courage it took to make it. Marcus never replied to the letter, but he kept it as a reminder of how much his life had changed. The Invisible Man had become visible by choice, and in doing so, he had found a purpose and meaning that his previous life had never provided. In the end, Marcus Chun learned that true invisibility was not about avoiding notice. It was about having the courage to be seen when it mattered most. The quiet, unassuming accountant who had spent 32 years in the background had discovered that sometimes the most important battles are fought by people who choose to step into the light, regardless of the consequences. His story became a testament to the idea that ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things when they choose to act with courage and integrity. Marcus had been easy to miss until he decided that some things were too important to ignore. The officially dead ink that had first caught his attention during the Blackwater audit became a symbol of how truth could be hidden but never truly buried. Like Marcus himself, the truth had a way of becoming visible when the right person was willing to look for it and brave enough to act on what they found.